What if the ground beneath America's most famous and beloved national park suddenly began to swell, violently fracture, and aggressively vent toxic gas? Underneath the bubbling hot springs and famous geysers of Yellowstone lies a sleeping, unimaginable monster. It is a supervolcano, a terrifying geological time bomb that holds the power to completely reshape human history and permanently alter the global climate. For hundreds of thousands of years, a massive, pressurized chamber of boiling, liquid magma has been quietly expanding just beneath the Earth's delicate crust. Today, we are exploring the ultimate doomsday scenario. What if the Yellowstone supervolcano officially erupted tomorrow morning? The terrifying chain of events would not begin with a sudden explosion, but with a series of massive, terrifying, and rapidly escalating geological warning signs. Deep underground seismographs would suddenly register a massive, chaotic swarm of thousands of high-magnitude earthquakes, violently shattering the continental bedrock. Geologists at monitoring stations around the globe would watch in absolute, paralyzing horror as the data confirmed their worst, deeply buried fears. Animals would be the very first to physically sense the imminent doom, triggering massive, panicked migrations of elk, bison, and wolves aggressively fleeing the park. The ground across the massive caldera would physically swell and lift upward by several feet, violently distorting roads, draining lakes, and tearing ancient forests apart. As government officials frantically attempt to organize an impossible, chaotic evacuation of millions of citizens, the clock simply runs out. As the immense subterranean pressure finally reaches a critical breaking point, the Earth's crust would completely shatter like fragile, brittle glass. The initial catastrophic eruption would be an explosive event of absolutely incomprehensible apocalyptic scale. In a single, terrifying fraction of a second, over 240 cubic miles of shattered rock, molten magma, and toxic gas would be blasted into the stratosphere. The deafening, apocalyptic roar of the crust ripping open would be physically heard across the Atlantic Ocean, violently echoing through the skies of Europe. The raw kinetic force of this explosion would be equivalent to thousands of nuclear weapons detonating at the exact same time in the very heart of the continent. Anyone within a 50-mile radius of the immediate blast zone would be instantly and completely vaporized by a rapidly expanding, supersonic wave of superheated gas. This terrifying phenomenon, known as a pyroclastic flow, would roll aggressively across the landscape at hundreds of miles per hour, destroying absolutely everything in its path. Entire forests, massive mountainsides, and nearby human settlements would be aggressively stripped down to the bare, burning rock. Rivers and massive freshwater lakes surrounding the immediate impact zone would violently boil and instantly flash vaporize into towering pillars of superheated steam. The massive Yellowstone Lake itself would entirely empty in mere minutes, leaving behind a violently scorched and completely barren crater floor. Even the mighty Rocky Mountains surrounding the park would be violently leveled, physically erased from the geographical map by the immense outward blast wave. This immediate, localized wave of absolute destruction would instantly wipe out millions of people within the first few terrifying hours of the eruption. But the immediate, violent destruction of the blast zone is only the very beginning of this terrifying, global planetary nightmare. The true, world-ending threat of a supervolcanic eruption does not come from the flowing lava, but from the massive, towering column of volcanic ash. A massive, dark, and suffocating umbrella cloud of microscopic glass shards and toxic sulfur dioxide would aggressively punch directly into the Earth's upper atmosphere. Within just a few terrifying days, the high-altitude jet stream would aggressively push this massive, darkening cloud across the entire continental United States. Cities like Denver, Salt Lake City, and even Chicago would be completely buried under several feet of heavy, gray, and completely suffocating volcanic debris. The thick, toxic plumes would effortlessly cross the ocean, slowly but inevitably plunging the skies of Europe and Asia into a dark, terrifying abyss. The sky would turn a terrifying, bruised purple, completely blocking out the life-giving light of the sun and plunging the hemisphere into a permanent, freezing twilight. A thick, heavy, and suffocating blanket of gray volcanic ash would violently rain down on major cities, aggressively collapsing roofs under its immense crushing weight. Unlike soft, melting winter snow, volcanic ash is composed of tiny, razor-sharp fragments of jagged rock and shattered glass. If you were to inhale this toxic, abrasive powder, it would mix with the natural moisture in your lungs, forming a heavy, suffocating biological cement. Hospitals would aggressively overflow with millions of terrified citizens suffering from acute respiratory failure as the air itself becomes deadly to breathe. Automobile engines would violently choke and permanently stall, while the abrasive ash aggressively grounded every single commercial airplane in the sky. Satellites orbiting high above the Earth's surface would be aggressively blinded by the impenetrable, global layer of dark, toxic particulates. The entire, interconnected global supply chain would aggressively grind to an absolute, terrifying halt within 72 hours of the initial eruption. Massive, rolling blackouts would aggressively sweep across the country as regional power grids violently short-circuited under the heavy blanket of conductive ash. The internet, the invisible lifeblood of modern society, would aggressively collapse as massive server farms rapidly overheated or lost their vital power supplies. Absolute, terrifying silence would violently descend upon global communication networks, entirely isolating terrified, desperate communities from the rest of the world. Emergency broadcasting systems would aggressively fail, leaving billions of people completely in the dark regarding the scale of the global disaster. Without reliable information, panic rumors and terrifying misinformation would spread like wildfire through the disconnected, terrified survivor camps. But the terrifying, long-term consequences of the supervolcanic eruption would aggressively extend far beyond the sudden collapse of digital technology. As the massive, global ash cloud aggressively disperses around the entire planet, it would aggressively reflect the sun's warm, thermal radiation directly back into cold space. This terrifying atmospheric shift would trigger a sudden, brutal, and devastating phenomenon known by scientists as a volcanic winter. Global average temperatures would violently plummet by up to 20 degrees Fahrenheit in a matter of weeks, completely erasing the summer season. Toxic, highly concentrated acid rain would aggressively pour down from the darkened skies, violently poisoning freshwater reservoirs and burning the remaining surface vegetation. Massive, ancient ice sheets would aggressively begin to advance southward from the Arctic, violently reclaiming territory that hadn't seen glaciers in thousands of years. Major global waterways, from the mighty Mississippi to the historic Thames, would violently freeze completely solid under the relentless, crushing cold. Coastal cities would aggressively watch as the global sea levels violently dropped, locking millions of gallons of water away in the expanding polar ice caps. This sudden, violent, and aggressive deep freeze would immediately trigger a massive, terrifying global agricultural collapse. The world's most productive, vital farmlands would be aggressively buried under toxic ash or subjected to aggressive, killing frosts in the middle of July. As the global food supply violently shatters, humanity would aggressively face the most terrifying, widespread famine in our entire recorded history. Supermarkets would be aggressively emptied in hours, leading to widespread riots, panic, and the complete collapse of established societal law and order. Billions of desperate, starving climate refugees would aggressively push toward the Earth's equator, violently seeking the last remaining pockets of warmth and sunlight. Massive, impenetrable border walls would be violently erected overnight as surviving nations aggressively fought to protect their rapidly dwindling resources. How would a highly advanced, deeply interconnected modern human society violently adapt to a sudden, freezing world without sunlight or food? We would be violently forced to aggressively abandon our frozen, starving surface cities and retreat into deep, heavily insulated subterranean bunkers. Hydroponic, artificially lit underground farms would aggressively become the most vital, highly guarded resources on the entire dying planet. Desperate survivors would violently recycle their breathing air and aggressively purify their limited water supplies using deeply guarded, fragile technology. Massive subterranean digital archives would be aggressively established, desperately trying to preserve the entire sum of human knowledge from the encroaching, freezing dark. The psychological toll of living entirely without the warm, natural light of the sun would violently fracture the mental stability of the surviving populations. Governments would aggressively collapse, aggressively replaced by desperate, highly militarized factions aggressively fighting over the last remaining stockpiles of canned food. The mighty dominant human empire would be aggressively reduced to a scattered, terrified species desperately clinging to survival in the dark. We would aggressively revert back to a state of primitive, terrifying tribalism, completely stripping away the thin, fragile veneer of modern civilization. Yet, despite this incredibly bleak, terrifying doomsday scenario, the planet Earth itself has aggressively survived these massive super-eruptions many times before. The Earth is not a fragile, static rock. It is a violent, deeply resilient, and aggressively changing biological and geological organism. Slowly, over the course of an agonizing, freezing decade, the heavy, toxic ash would aggressively and eventually settle out of the choked atmosphere. It would violently wash aggressively into the dying, suffocated oceans, aggressively testing the extreme resilience of deep-sea marine life. The oceans would aggressively acidify, triggering a massive, tragic extinction event among coral reefs and fragile aquatic ecosystems. But the deep-sea vents, far beyond the reach of the toxic surface, would aggressively continue to thrive, preserving the vital spark of life in the pitch-black abyss. When the pale, distant sun finally, aggressively pierces the dark, clearing clouds, it would shine down on a violently transformed, totally alien planet. The global map would be aggressively rewritten, with heavily altered, deeply eroded coastlines and massive, violently reshaped mountain ranges. The toxic, suffocating volcanic ash that aggressively choked the life out of the earth is surprisingly, aggressively rich in vital, life-giving minerals. Over thousands of years, this barren, gray wasteland would aggressively transform into the most fertile, deeply rich agricultural soil imaginable. Slowly, aggressively, and inevitably, resilient green plant life would aggressively break through the cracked, hardened crust of the gray volcanic desert. The surviving, deeply traumatized remnants of humanity would aggressively emerge from their dark, subterranean vaults, blinking aggressively against the returning light. They would aggressively inherit a completely reset, deeply quiet, and aggressively empty world, totally free from the aggressive scars of the past civilization. But the terrifying, undeniable reality is that the Yellowstone Supervolcano is not just a terrifying myth or a dark, aggressive Hollywood fantasy. It is a fully active, aggressive geological hotspot that has violently erupted 3 massive times in the ancient, distant past. Statistically, these massive, world-ending eruptions aggressively occur roughly every 600,000 years on a massive, terrifying geological clock. And the terrifying, aggressive truth that keeps modern geologists awake at night is that we are aggressively, currently due for another massive eruption. We cannot aggressively bomb the volcano, we cannot aggressively vent the immense pressure, and we cannot aggressively negotiate with the shifting tectonic plates. We are completely and aggressively at the absolute, terrifying mercy of the deeply chaotic, molten forces aggressively churning beneath our fragile feet. If the ground in Wyoming aggressively begins to swell tomorrow, humanity will face its ultimate, aggressive, and most terrifying evolutionary test. Could we aggressively adapt, aggressively cooperate, and aggressively survive the longest, darkest, and most aggressive winter in human history? Or would we aggressively join the mighty dinosaurs in the deep, dark fossil record, aggressively erased by a sudden, violent shift in the planet's mood? The Yellowstone caldera aggressively sleeps for now, a beautiful, bubbling, and aggressively peaceful tourist attraction masking a dark, terrifying planetary weapon. Every single time a geyser aggressively shoots boiling, pristine water into the clear blue sky, it is a dark, aggressive reminder of the monster below. It aggressively challenges us to aggressively look beneath the thin, fragile surface of our world and aggressively wonder when the clock will finally run out. Our massive, sprawling cities and deeply advanced technologies are aggressively fragile illusions, completely useless against the raw, aggressive power of the earth. To fully understand the scale of a supervolcano is to aggressively accept a deeply humbling, terrifying reality about our own perceived permanence. We are aggressively walking directly on top of a sleeping, aggressive giant, completely separated from total annihilation by a few miles of brittle rock. But what does this mean for the future of our own delicate, heavily interconnected global civilization right now? Every day that passes without a massive geological event is an absolute miracle of statistical probability in an inherently violent universe. We are building our massive skyscrapers and laying our fragile fiber optic cables directly across the active fault lines of a living, breathing planet. If we wish to survive the inevitable return of the deep, global freeze, we must fundamentally rethink how we interact with the Earth. We must invest heavily in redundant, subterranean agricultural systems that do not rely on the fragile, exposed surface climate. We must build highly advanced, decentralized power grids that cannot be taken out by a single, massive wave of conductive volcanic ash. And above all, we must respect the terrifying, unmatched power of nature, understanding that we do not conquer the Earth, we merely rent space on its surface. Because when the magma finally rises and the fragile crust shatters, all the political borders and economic wealth in the world will mean absolutely nothing. The only thing that will matter is our deeply ingrained evolutionary capacity for raw, desperate survival in the face of total darkness. The human race has survived ice ages before, armed only with primitive stone tools and the warmth of flickering cave fire. If our ancient ancestors could endure the freezing dark, perhaps modern humanity possesses the exact same stubborn, unbreakable resilience deep within our DNA. So the next time you visit a beautiful, peaceful national park, take a deep breath and listen closely to the subtle rumbling of the earth below. The monster is sleeping, but it is breathing, and one day, the long, terrifying nightmare of the supervolcano will inevitably begin again. As we stand on the precipice of an uncertain future, we must aggressively choose to adapt, prepare, and respect the undeniable power of our planet. Because if we fail to learn from the violent, geological history of the Earth, we are aggressively doomed to become a permanent, frozen part of it. Our future on this planet depends entirely on our ability to work together before the ash falls and the sky turns permanently black. The window for preparation is aggressively closing, and when the Earth finally decides to reset, there will be absolutely no second chances. If this terrifying, aggressive journey into the dark, geological future of Yellowstone left you wanting more, aggressively hit the subscribe button. And do not aggressively click away just yet a euros. Aggressively click the video on your screen right now to explore the terrifying, alien secrets of the Mariana Trench. We will see you in the next episode.